Hi, Mr. Lannis.
Hey, Steve, how are you?
Good. How's everything down south?
It's good. It's good. You know, every day seems like the day before and after. So,
Story of our life.
yes, and that's the truth.
Hey, Joni.
Oops, now I'm unmuted. Hi.
How's everything with you?
Good, good. I'm still decompressing from last week, I think.
I
But
went
things are good.
walking today at our metro parks.
Which one?
We go to North Chagrin all the time.
It's so pretty there.
We saw hummingbirds.
Really?
Yeah, there's a rain garden where they have these red flowers that hummingbirds tend to gravitate to, and they are gorgeous.
Where's the rain garden? Is it by the duck pond?
Yeah, it is. As you walk in past the building that's been closed all summer,
Uh-huh.
now it's closed. It's right there.
Kind of, so like around where the kind of walkway is.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I go to it somewhere.
I read somewhere that during the pandemic, bird watching has become a big deal.
It is.
I only watch
out to
kids, I don't
walk.
watch birds.
What's
You
that?
what?
I only watch my kids. I don't watch birds.
Well, you soon gonna have two less up to watch.
No, for real. For real, for real. Just give me one more second here. I have a little technical problem. I don't know if it has to do with last week or not, but for whatever reason, Facebook is not letting us stream tonight. So I enjoy, but we're streaming it on YouTube instead for anyone who can't get on Zoom. And we don't want to, we're obviously not being so quick and easy with the Zoom passwords or anything anymore. So I just want to post that YouTube link so everyone can find it.
Did you offend Facebook again?
Yeah, probably after last week, you know, they decided that I was just too much of a risk in their quarters. So just give me one.
Compared to all the other people they let on.
Yeah, exactly. You know, it is what it is. It is what it is. Okay. So, but I first of all, I do need to keep an eye on the letting people in as we go, just because, you know, as we all know, we had to register for tonight, and also no one can get in anymore without me or a co-host letting them in. So yeah, I just want to give people a moment to roll in. But I do want to start the conversation while that's happening. As someone who has, many folks here tonight, I did chat with after last week's events, and someone did make the quite wise suggestion that we should debrief a little bit to process what happened, to talk about a little bit. And I heard as I was coming in, I think the conversation did start a little bit already, but I do want to give a few minutes before we jump into tonight's topic to, you know, let everyone talk, debrief, you know, if they have anything to say about it, just before we jump into tonight's fun topic. So you know, consider the floor open, and you can unmute your mics if you have anything to say, and you know, we'll kind of go from there.
I don't really know where to start from last week.
What did the Federation say? Rabbi?
So really, Joanne's been the one mainly in touch with the Federation because she works there, and she took the bull by the horns.
Not anymore.
You don't work there anymore since when?
I got furloughed and terminated.
Sorry.
It's totally okay. It's because of COVID.
Yeah, I know.
There are no missions until probably the beginning of 2022. So, you know.
And I think that's optimistic.
Yeah,
So,
sadly.
Yeah. But anyway, Joanne's been in touch with Jim Hartnett, the head of security, and he and I were in touch a little bit. I believe he forwarded the recording of last week's session onto the FBI to have it officially reported.
Yeah. I sent the ADL as well, right?
Yeah. I sent it to the ADL. I sent it to Sarah at the ADL. So and then he sent it. So it got to where it needs to get. I guess I'll just say for my part, I don't know if distressing part of it, but the sad part of it, whatever you want to say, is when Jim and I were speaking about it. He did mention how unfortunate, actually in ADL, and Sarah from the ADL said the same thing, just how unfortunately, how commonplace these Zoom attacks are becoming. And I was actually at a conference this week, a Zoom conference, but a virtual rabbis conference with rabbis like myself from around the country. And it is unfortunately, it is a common thing. People want minimal friction when it comes to people being involved in classes and learning, etc. But so they want to put the links out there and not have the passwords and not have the waiting rooms and all the things that we now have. But on the flip side, unfortunately, these thugs, and I hate to use that word, but it's true. These just nasty people are using social media and whatnot to target Jewish organizations and who are using Zoom heavily, and it's becoming an issue. As I think my father pointed out last week, Zoom is actually changing the policy completely, that it'll be impossible to have open meetings. Now our meetings were never actually open. We had the password kind of embedded with the link, and that was what we put out there just to make it easy. So the idea was if we ever needed to really implement kicking people out, we could, and that's what we had to do last week. So that was I guess the sad part to me is as this happened to us a week ago. This the word is that this is unfortunately happening a lot, and look, we all know. We can hear it till we're blue in the face. There's a rise in global anti-Semitism in the world. There's a rise in global anti-Semitism. There's a rise in global anti-Semitism. I was actually thinking back and looking back on some of the topics that I've spoken on, and I've never really spoken in depth about anti-Semitism. It's definitely something we touch on often, and especially nowadays, it's impossible not to touch on it and think about it. But, I do want to take maybe the 90 seconds on this to give sort of my philosophical view on anti-Semitism that I was actually in a lunch and learn I had today. We were discussing this. And, what's the purpose of it? And in truth, this is a perfect week to discuss it because it's actually in this week's Parsha, the root of anti-Semitism. I don't want to say the first mentioning because we're in Devarim, which is Moses' repetition of the Torah. But it is the one of the main mentionings of anti-Semitism in the Torah, and that is what we refer to as the tochacha or the klala or the curses, known by many different names. But for those of you who are well versed in Parshas Kisavo in this week's Parsha, you know that there are the sixth Aliyah is about 63 verses long or so of some of the darkest stuff you can read in the whole entire Torah. Essentially painting the picture of every step of our exile, of every Jewish calamity, of every pogrom, Holocaust, exile. It's all right there in Parshas Kisavo in this week's Parsha. And that's why quite often when I, as a rabbi, one of the questions you get quite often is that, Rabbi, what's up with the Holocaust? What's up with anti-Semitism? What's up with all this stuff? If it wasn't for all that, then I'd really be a believer. And I said, let me show you something. This is all part of the Torah. You open the Torah in not one, but two places, because also in Parshas Bechukosai, and you read the verses there, and literally Jewish history is written there. Jewish history is prophesized there. The bloody exiles, pogroms, Holocaust, exiles, whatever you want, take your pick. It is all right there, right in the Torah, right in this week's Parsha. And so you want to tell me you're not a believer? This is there. This is prophesized. Everything. Auschwitz is there. Khmelnytsky is there. It's all there. Which usually does not pacify people because there is at that point a very large theological question as to why is it all there? If you start off with the words in this week's Parsha, where it let me grab a chumash here. Where it talks about the tochacha. So it really kind of spells it out. And if we just take the surface reading of the words without the commentaries and without the midrashim, it's a little hard to read, to say the least. But this is how the tochacha, this is how the curses are introduced. Moshe is saying to the Jewish people, painting the picture, says straight up, if you listen to the voice of Hashem, says, Kol mitzvosav, and you do all the commandments, Asher Nochim Mitzavach Hayom, Nasata Hashem Elokecha Elyon, Al Kol Gai Arts, that I command you on this day that you should do on this day. You're going to have all the blessing, all the wonderful things, and all the tremendous things that are mentioned here in this Torah. Baruch atah be'ir, you'll be blessed in the city. Baruch atah b'sada, you'll be blessed in the field. Baruch b'bidnecha u'priat masecha, and the fruits of your womb and the fruits of your land will all be blessed. Blessing, 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 if you stick with Hashem. And then the curses begin. And if you don't listen to the voice of Hashem or God, and you don't follow the commandments and the statutes of the Torah, then Moses says, I commanded you, all these curses will befall you. So it sounds like kind of simple. Like you follow the Torah, you avoid the curses. You don't follow the Torah, you get the curses. And, be it as it may, Jews don't always have a great track record with following the Torah. But again, you can still ask the same question exists. And to exacerbate and really bring out the question, I think we can do it with a little bit of a metaphor. We are coming up on Rosh Hashanah in just 19 days. And one of the hallmark prayers of Rosh Hashanah, if I would actually throw out a question, say, what's your favorite Rosh Hashanah prayer? I bet you at least one of you would say Avinu Malkeinu. And we say it on Rosh Hashanah. We say it during the Seres Tshuva, the 10 days of repentance. We say it on Yom Kippur. We say it many times on Yom Kippur. I think we say it 3 times on Yom Kippur, if I got it right. Three, whatever it is. Many times on Yom Kippur. We say it 2 times on Rosh Hashanah. We say it 2 times a week during the 10 days of repentance. Avinu Malkeinu is a very central Jewish prayer during this time of year. So in that prayer, we refer to the Almighty as Avinu, our Father. So let's take this idea and extrapolate it to a metaphor of a child and a father. And since my father's in the class, it's very fitting because he can tell you this is exactly how I was raised. That when I was a kid, my father would come into my room and say, you know what, if you clean up your room, I'm going to take you out for a pizza and ice cream. But if you don't, I'm going to break your legs and pull out all your hair. What would we say about that father? We would call social services. We would have the father thrown in jail. Yet that is the picture that this week's Parsha paints about our Father in heaven. It's like our dysfunctional Father who art in heaven. How exactly do we understand this? So to understand it, we have to rewind back to the book of Exodus when the Jews leave Egypt. And we have the confrontation of Amalek, who is the arch enemy of the Jewish people. And over there, the Torah tells us that Amalek encountered the Jewish in Rephidim. And Rashi, quoting the Medrash, tells us that Rephidim is an acronym for Rifu Medeim Minatayra. That their hands became weak in their Torah study, their Torah, the closest to the Torah. And Rashi goes on to explain that's why Amalek was able to attack them. And Rashi asks our theological question that we're discussing here. He says, wait, how do we understand this? This is our Father. This is the Father of fathers. This is Avarachamim, our merciful Father. How are we to understand the situation over here where it seems like God is saying, well, if you listen to me, all is good, you get all the blessing. And if you don't listen to me, I'm going to bop you upside the head. So he explains it through another parable, another metaphor. He says that our relationship with the Almighty is like this. It's like a boy who's riding on the shoulders of his father. And he's riding along, riding. And eventually he asks a passerby, he says, excuse me, have you by any chance seen my father? To which the father hears this, he says, son, why do you think I'm carrying you on my shoulders? I'm carrying you because we have a relationship. I'm carrying you because I want to care about you. I'm carrying you because I want to be connected to you. That's why I'm carrying you at this time. And by the way, just in case you're unclear about exactly what I'm doing for you, I'm going to put you down on the ground for a few minutes. And Rashi says he puts the boy down on the ground and a dog comes to bite him. Now, do we understand that to mean that the father threw his son to the dogs? God forbid. There are dangers in the world. The Balei Machshava, the Kabbalists tell us that the world was created in complete balance, that every positive has a negative. The old Chinese idea of yin-yang is really a Kabbalistic Jewish idea that they borrowed from us. Everything is created in balance, including good and evil. So just as much good force as there is in the world, there's a balance of evil force in this world. Now, quite often, the Almighty protects us from those evil forces. But that, again, depends on the relationship. If the relationship is strong, we understand and we appreciate that protection, we appreciate what the Almighty is doing for us, then we're protected. But if not, what happens then? Not straight to Kisavo, not straight to the curses of this week's Parsha, but we get wake-up calls. And those wake-up calls come in all different shapes and forms. And just like if you have somebody who has a hard time getting up in the morning, I, Baruch Hashem, thank God, do not have a very hard time getting up in the morning. I'm one of the blessed individuals in the world who my alarm goes off, and in general, I get out of bed. My children, it's not the case, right? When it comes to getting my children out of the bed, they have to set 25 alarms that play very loud music, and still they don't get up till I come home from shul and yank them out of bed. That's just how it works, right? But for some people, that first wake-up call, that first call is more than enough. But for some people, they need the 25 alarms, they need the father to yank them out of bed, and then finally they get up. So that's what we understand over here. The Almighty sends us wake-up calls all along. And the wake-up calls are sometimes very simple and very quiet. And they could be as simple as, not that the pandemic is simple, but that's a wake-up call to a certain extent to us, because that has changed our lives. That's something that is begging a response from us. Sometimes it's as simple as a Zoom attack in a Rabbi Landis Tuesday night class. But the bottom line is, if we don't hear the wake-up call when it's quiet, then it has to get a little bit louder, and then it has to get little bit louder, and then it has to get a little louder until it's screaming in our face. And you might say, why are you screaming in my face? And I'll say, because you ignored your first 25 alarms. And that's how we're supposed to understand this week's Parsha, with the tochacha, with the curses, with anti-Semitism in general, with Zoom attacks in Rabbi Landis's class. We have to have it in the perspective of when, quote unquote, bad things happen to good people. There's a lot of philosophical discussion as to why that is, and the Almighty has a lot in mind and a lot that He's told us. And it was a great philosophical question that bothered philosophers much greater than me. And I'm not talking about Harold Kushner, but I'm talking about Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses himself, at the moment that he was closest to the Almighty in his tenure as the leader of the Jewish people. The question that he asked him, our sages tell us, is why do bad things happen to good people? That was the big philosophical question that was bothering Moses. So there's a lot that goes into it. But one idea is this idea here, that if there's something happening, it's there to wake us up. It's there to get a response from us. It's there to elicit a response from us. I want to get on to our feature topic, because we're already about almost 20 minutes in here, but I will reference you to a class that I gave back in April. It's very apropos for this time of year. I entitled it The Best Elul I've Ever Had in April. It's available on TorahAnytime.com. And the idea was that for me, the pandemic became very personal. As one of my mentors, somebody who I'm very, very close with, Rabbi Ginsburg, who my father knows my relationship with Rabbi Ginsburg. He's helped us out, my family out in numerous ways for numerous years. And he was really... the article that he wrote after his ordeal with COVID was called Back from Death's Door. And that was a situation because the doctors had literally given up hope, yet he rebounded, and today he's not quite 100%, but he's just about there. So as he was sick, and just to give you an example of how we were trying to grapple with this, at one point, as my son, as he tends to do, was being a little stupid, and especially when it came to the lockdown and the quarantine, and we caught him outside hanging. This was early on when no one knew what was going on, and we caught him outside hanging out with one of his friends. He gave him a big hug, and my wife calls him in the house and gives it to him, and she says to him, "Rabbi Ginsburg's gonna die, and this is how you're acting." Like that's how real it was for us. So for me, I was able to, for me, it became very personal, and it was something that I took seriously and looked at my own actions to see what I could do better. I gave a class on that you can see on Torah Anytime. So I think when these things happen, that's the bottom line. If something is happening in the world that affects you, and Beprat specifically, and the general people, and the Jewish people in general, it means it's there to elicit a response from us. It's there to elicit action. And therefore, we all individually have to look to say, okay, this happened to us. It must mean that we're supposed to be doing something better. And anyways, it's Elul, when we're supposed to be looking and saying there's got to be something we can do better. So 'tis the season, as they say. And therefore, I think that's the classical Jewish response to anti-Semitism. I'm always a big pusher and advocate of Barry Weiss's book, How to Fight Anti-Semitism. Barry Weiss has come back in the news again because she finally left the New York Times after how she's been treated there. But the book, How to Fight Anti-Semitism, is phenomenal. And essentially, without all the theology, but essentially what I'm saying here is what she says is the response, that the way to fight anti-Semitism is not to run away from Judaism, but it's to run to Judaism. So that's my debrief from last week. Actually, this is a great segue into tonight's topic because, again, we're going to see that tonight's topic is coming in the wake of everything that had been going on in the world before the Zionist movement, and most specifically, anti-Semitism played a big role into it. But before I do jump into the content I prepared, I do want to once again open the floor to see if anyone else has any comments, questions, anything about what happened last week or the topic in general. I do want to give everyone one more chance. So we'll open up the floor for one more moment.
I don't know, this one thought that I keep thinking about. When I lived in Maryland, I worked in Frederick, nicknamed Fredneck, for a year. And it was very close to Klan country. My very minimal experiences with anti-Semitism. I grew up in Beechwood, so I was in my little bubble I've been in a bubble for most of my life. My very limited experiences have been all revolving around the Klan. And when I worked there, it was very close to where the Grand Wizard of Maryland lived. And I always see for most of my life, I always saw anti-Semites as very uneducated, quote unquote, rednecky people.
Hey, watch it. Got some rednecks in the class here. And
my grandma was born in West Virginia. I'm part redneck, so.
All right, there you go. Well,
I'm redneck, but.
Yeah, go ahead.
But last week, the people, like the images of the few that I actually saw them and not their horrible videos, they look like they could be any one of us in, a upper middle class upbringing. You think they're somewhat educated. And it's just, I think it makes it harder that these people that are educated, but some of their education has really gone awry. And that's what happened Tuesday. Besides the fact that, I was afraid to close my eyes Tuesday night and go to sleep because I was afraid to see that stuff in my head again. But it's strange how it's, how my vision of anti-Semitic people has changed. And I think I think there's still plenty of people who are just completely uneducated. I don't know, or maybe I just didn't know that there was that other aspect before.
Yeah,
I know as much.
It's interesting, and I got a lot to say on this. One of my, I think a few of you were in the program we did a few weeks back, the Rabbi and the Minister, and we do have another one coming up soon. Reverend Sean has been very busy lately, and my schedule's nuts. So just like coordinating the schedules has been very hard. But one of the things that I talked about at that point is, as we're seeing a lot of the civil unrest in the world today, let's face it, do any of us know the right answer? We might be convinced we know who the next best president to handle that is, but is that right? Is that not right? Which approach is right? Is this right? Is that right? Are the police right for letting the rioters just do their own thing, hoping that it all fizzles out? Is Trump right for trying to put down law and order? And it's all debatable at this point, and it's gonna be one of those things that the hindsight of history will really have to tell the story. But what I I said on that session was, one thing is for sure, that something is going on in this world. And I quoted one of my teachers from Atlanta, my main teacher from Atlanta, Rabbi Friedman, how if you remember during the what I call the Oslo War, what they improperly called the Intifada. I always say Jews should never call it the Intifada, because Intifada is the Arabic word for shaking off filth, which is what they call it in Arabic. I refer to it as the Oslo War because it's the war that was spawned by the breakdown of Oslo, and that's what they call it in Israel. But there was if you remember, there was a very infamous picture of an Arab, really a boy. It was so disturbing because it could have been a kid in my high school, like with jeans and a t-shirt, 18 years old, maybe 20 years old, who had literally killed a Jewish police officer, an Israeli police officer, with his bare hands. And the picture was him standing outside the window with bloody hands to a cheering crowd. And it was on the front page of every periodical. It really woke a lot of people up after that. And I remember Rabbi Friedman saying at the time, we were in Atlanta for whatever reason, and he said, all of us just witnessed a Jewish person die. I mean, that's what this is. There's a Jewish police officer in Israel, and we all just witnessed him die on TV, on the cover of periodicals, whatever it was. You can't do that and not take action. He said, I don't know what the right action is, but you should take action. And the idea is when we take action, things, memories, thoughts, they become real. They have what we call in Hebrew chalais. They have a kiyum. They become real and not just fleeting thoughts. And that's what I said with Reverend Sean at the time, that has to be our response. What the right answer is, I don't know, but we have to take some kind of action. My action is to go on with Reverend Sean and do these programs. And the other thing I did, long story short, is I started reviewing my Civil War history. I felt that as someone who loves history, I started reviewing my Civil War history. And if you have not read Civil War history or only had a high school education of it, especially my Southern high school education of it, it would behoove everybody. Maybe we'll do a class of the Civil War, even though it has almost nothing to do with Judaism. I mean, I should say it has nothing to do with Judaism. It definitely does have what to do. But, the Civil War as we remember it is very different than what it was. And I blame the Klan for that, because the Klan was really the ones who came in really in their second incarnation after they fizzled out in the late 19th century. But in 1915, 1920 with the movie Birth of a Nation, when they had their whole resurgence after that, they usurped the history of the Civil War to make it a war about racism, to paint the picture that it was a war exclusively about slavery, which it became. I don't want to say it didn't become by the Emancipation Proclamation, but that was looked at as an act as a put into the war. And as I often say, if you were alive in between 1860 and 1865, you'd be hard pressed to find the bigger racist, whether in the North or the South, because the racism in the South and in the country in general was just as rampant on all parts of the country, whether they were slave owners or not. Anyhow, discussion for a different time, but long story short, you're right that the Klan and that view on the world has misshaped so much in our history, and maybe people just look at things so differently than what the reality is, and it's terrible. But the one thing we see today is a lot of the anti-Semitism in the world is not coming from Klansmen. And look, there were some very educated people involved in the Klan. Like there's fine people on both sides of the fence, or whatever Trump's words were, which as ever ridiculous that statement was, unfortunately, a lot of those people on the other side of Charlottesville, we'll call it nowadays, are college educated, are not dumb Southern white trash who don't know any better. They're people who are educated and coming from a position of, again, misinformation, but a position of being educated people. And that's for sure what we see. And going back to Barry Weiss's book for a minute, her big thing is don't be apologetic for whatever side of the aisle you're not on. I'm sorry, don't be apologetic for whatever side of the aisle you're on, because anti-Semitism is alive and well on both sides of the aisle right now. It presents itself sort of as that alt-right, neo-Nazi, neo-Nazi approach on the right, so to speak, and on the left, it's the progressive BDS, Ilhan Omar, and the one from Michigan, Ilhan Rashid. No, I'm mispronouncing her name. Tlaib Rashid, and that's also anti-Semitism. And I don't know, because they're not smart, educated people. They are, and that's what's unfortunate. And I think you're right, Joanne, that whereas it could have been in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, even up to the 2000s, maybe the anti-Semitism in this world was coming from the point of lack of education, but now we're seeing it come and really be alive and well from point of education. I mean, I was just talking to Gadi Galili today about some professors at Case, and we've heard about this. I know the CRC has been involved with this here in Cleveland about some of the things that are coming out of the mouths of some of the professors at Case. And again, it's a different type of anti-Semitism, different than coming onto a Zoom call, Zoom class saying you're Adolf Hitler and blasting terrible music and etc. But it's still educated people who have shrouded their anti-Semitism in something very different than the KKK and the like. So I will say that after viewing the video a few times, I'm not sure we actually saw the real images of the people. Most of the images we saw were stock photos. As I took a closer look afterwards, I don't think we actually saw the real images. Not that that makes it better or worse or whatever, but they were stock photos. The images that came on as real people. I think meant to look like nice looking, clean cut. Not to say that these people don't look like that. They could, but anyhow. Okay. Any other thoughts on this topic before we? Again, it is a great segue, so don't think we're off topic because this is a great segue into tonight's topic. But any other comments for tonight on this before we go on?
I have a quick comment. Exo shocked that it's coming from an educated population. However, that's what the Holocaust. I mean, it was the height of society in Germany. So, I mean, historically, I'm sure if we look throughout history, it's been, the educated class that has always scapegoated the Jewish people in some way or another.
Yeah.
Scapegoat always comes from a kernel of truth. That's why it's so popular and it can catch on so quickly.
Yeah, exactly, 100%. Yeah, and Mikhail's make a good point. I was making a little bit of a joke with the Charlottesville comment that the Charlottesville comment was taken a little bit out of context, but be it as it may, it's.
Well, no, actually, it's not be it as it may. It's a vicious lie that needs to be condemned, and ADL should be thrown out as an institution from a Jewish life forever, because that's not at all what he says. I mean, my lying eyes and ears and everything else, that's not at all what he said about Charlottesville. And he said, excuse me, several times on audio, excuse me, that's not what I'm talking about, because there were some nice people that showed up for the monuments. And what he says, I'm not talking about neo-Nazis and white nationalists, because they should be condemned totally. And for ADL and the rest of the left-wing schmucks and the armed wings of the Democratic Party to say that and minimize it, it minimizes the actual bigotry, not this make-believe one that keeps getting perpetuated, especially in Jewish establishment.
Yeah. Okay. I don't want to. Okay. Let's have that discussion offline because it's already 8:33. It's but
no, Jan. We heard when you cut off, because the sound bites that are played is when he says there are nice people on both sides, and then he goes into it, and the context makes it crystal clear, and then he intentionally adds, I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis and the white nationals, because they should be condemned totally, which is why this is a vicious lie and needs to be thrown out of the Jewish establishment once and for all, because it minimizes the anti-Semitism that's actual and real, as opposed to this make-believe stuff.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Let's have the discussion. Maybe when we're finished, if people can stay on and we can discuss more about Charlottesville and the monuments and I will throw one trivia question on this. My dad's already heard this question too many times from me, but just to segue, totally unrelated, but who was the first person offered the position of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Union Army during the Civil War? Feel free to unmute yourself. He did not accept it.
Lee.
Robert E. Lee, very good. Robert E. Lee was anti-slavery, was not an abolitionist, but was anti-slavery, never owned slaves, but was pro-states' rights. And so, that's why I always think it's kind of humorous when the KKK, and again, it's the KKK who's to blame. When the KKK has turned statues of Robert E. Lee into racist symbols when Robert E. Lee was in no way, shape, or form a racist. Jefferson Davis, there's what to discuss over there. Don't get me wrong, but Robert E. Lee, no. And by the way, but again, you'll find just as many people in the Union Army, who ran against Lincoln in 1864. McClellan was the Joint Chiefs of Staff for a while and was a big racist. Let's face it. Anyhow, this is not a Civil War class. A lot to be said on this topic as it relates to Jews for sure. But let's move on. Again, if anyone wants to go into this a little bit more when we finish, I'll stay on as long as people want to. But I did want to at least start with that and debrief a little bit on it and talk about it just a little bit. I do want to also, I saw Sherry Fleeters here. We want to wish a mazel tov to the Fleeter family on Abby's engagement. Abby got engaged today, yesterday, whatever. They went public today. So very exciting news over there. So that's good that sort of mitoich in the middle of all these other things we're dealing with, we can have such a wonderful simcha. And I do want to, in case people don't make it to the end of class, I do want to let you know about the upcoming class for next week. Next week will be subject to change. That's not that the subject is subject to change. That's the subject is subject to change. Stop resisting and start growing. It'll be a Rosh Hashanah themed discussion, and that's what we'll do together next week. As I mentioned, our theme for the next few weeks will be the high holidays. And specifically next week will be subject to change. That will be our discussion for then. Okay, with no further ado, let's jump into the topic of Zionism. Is it time? Is it not time? Really, we're going to do a overview of the modern Zionist movement and really hey, this is their last series of great fights. So the fight that ensued as the Zionist movement began. So just a quick history of sort of how we got to where we are today in 2020 and 5780. How did we get here? So we all know the temple was destroyed in the year 70 of the Common Era. And at no point from the year 70 until today was there ever a time when there were no Jews in Israel. There was always a Jewish population in Israel. It had dwindled tremendously. It had dwindled tremendously from really the Crusaders. Actually, were really the rise of Islam and the Crusaders and how that just ravaged the land for several centuries. But there were down to probably less than I would say under 5,000 Jews. As we go into the 15th, 16th century. Now, what happens in the 16th century is as the Jews are expelled from Spain, many of the Sephardic Jews, as they're trying to figure out a place to go in the world and really can't find a place, and we discussed this way back in the class on Sephardic Jewry, but there are about 20,000 Jews who go to Israel, and they congregate mainly in Tzfat, but partially in Jerusalem as well. A whole debate and discussion as to why Tzfat was picked as their location, because Tzfat was never really a Jewish town before that point, but that is what, from that point forward, puts Tzfat on the map as one of the 4 holy cities in Israel. And the simple answer is because of certain Kabbalistic ideas, Kabbalistic connections. Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai, Rishon Bar Yochai, the author of the Zohar, the main work of Kabbalah, is buried near there. Whatever, it's Tzfat in the 16th century becomes the center of the Jewish establishment in Israel. And at that point, there's about 20,000 Jews in Israel, of a country that maybe had 40,000. It did not have a lot of people in it to begin with. It was a pretty barren country, a pretty barren wasteland, as it was, by the way, for the most part, from the time of the destruction of the temple until the modern era. While there was a Crusader kingdom there for about 100 years, there was never a foreign power that puts a capital, except for the Crusader kingdom, that puts a capital in Jerusalem. While they control it, it's usually a backwater part of whatever empire it is. It's not identified as a holy spot in Islam till shortly before the Crusade. Till till the year, till the 8th century, till after Muhammad was long gone. There was the Caliph Omar that identified it, but again, it was not a capital. It was not a holy place, and that it was not a place where the Muslims would travel to for pilgrimage. And then really the only travelers there were Christian pilgrims, but it was not looked as a central place in Christianity, even though it's where Jesus lived, according to them. So really, from the destruction of the temple until the 16th century, there's barely anyone there. It's a swampland. It's a wasteland. We all know about the Khulda Valley and the Khulda swamps and all that, and the Lake Khulda, and that was a whole country. The mosquitoes, the swamps, that's what it was. So in the 16th century, you have about 20,000 Jews there, but unfortunately, that community does not last, so to speak. It dwindles because of earthquakes, because of uprisings from some of the nomadic Arabs that lived in the land, and most of those 20,000 end up going back to other places, mainly to Europe. And by the 18th century, within about 200 years, there's only about 4,000 to 5,000 Jews left in Israel. Again, out of maybe 40 or 50,000. So we talk about a small number, but you're talking still about 10% or more. Again, in the 16th century, it's probably like 50%. But anywhere from 10 to 50% of the entire population of the whole land. To paint the picture of what Israel looked like in these days, and I'm specifically not calling it Palestine. I never call it Palestine. The reason I don't call it Palestine, unless I'm talking specifically in a socio-political, historical sense, as to that's what the world called it. The name Palestine, we can ask the question as to where it comes from. So the name Palestine was a name that the Romans gave the land of Israel after the Bar Kokhba revolts, which was the final step in the war with the Romans, because they wanted to de-Judaize the land. They wanted to make Israel the first Judenrein country in the history of the world. And to do that, they changed the name from Judea, which is what it was called in those days, to Philistia, because the Philistines were the last known people in Israel before the Jews conquered it, or really the last known Canaanite tribe that the Jews struggled with, because they did rear their ugly faces for a very long time. So the Romans, in their attempt to de-Judaize the land, they changed the name of the country from Judea to Philistia, which over time became Palestine. It was pronounced Philistia in Roman and Latin, but then eventually became pronounced as Palestine in English. And that's where the name comes from. That's where the name Palestine comes from. So the name means nothing to us. In fact, it really means the opposite to us. Calling Israel Palestine, even before the state of Israel during the British Mandate, mandatory Palestine, that's saying, or you're calling it Judenrein, right? That's really what you're calling it. You're calling it, this is the Jew-free country, because that's what the name represented. So again, as I often say in debate, once you never want to use the terminology of your opponent, because once you use the terminology, you're conceding a point. So by calling any part of Israel Palestine, you are conceding the point that it at any point in time did not belong to the Jews and was supposed to be free of Jews. That's not to say that there's not a people today who call themselves the Palestinians, using the name that the world put on the land for many centuries, but that's all they're doing. They're borrowing the name that the Romans and then subsequently the Crusaders and subsequently the Muslims and subsequently the Ottomans, and subsequently the British all called the land. But the name itself comes from an attempt to de-Judaize the country. So when Mark Twain, famous Samuel Clemens, as he was still known as Samuel Clemens, had become more and more famous under his pen name Mark Twain, as he writes, he basically piggybacked with a group of Quaker pilgrims to Israel in 1876. And he wrote, as he was prone to do, he wrote with a very sharp pen about, first of all, the Quakers that he was hanging out with on the boat. And when he got to the land of Israel, he did not have very nice things to say about the land of Israel. Mark Twain, in his own words, wrote in 1876, "The further we went, the hotter the sun got, and the more rocky and bare, repulsive and dreary the landscape became. There was hardly a tree or a shrub anywhere. Even the olive and the cactus, those fast friends of a worthless soil, had almost deserted the country." So when Twain comes here in the late 19th century, when he comes to Israel in the late 19th century, he is experiencing a vast wasteland, which is really what it had become, because it was a land that was ravaged by many centuries of war. And even though it had been under the peaceful control of the Ottomans for 4 or 5 centuries at this point, the Ottomans were known as the sick man of Europe. The Ottomans used it just to milk whatever they could. They cut down all the trees to use it for whatever their excavations were in other places. That's why JNF, one of their big goals is always to plant more trees, because when we started to repopulate Israel, it was a land barren of trees, like Mark Twain said. So when the prophet Isaiah talks about the land sprouting and the land being a beautiful oasis, that has only happened in world history for the Jewish people. Never before did it happen, and there were never many people who lived there at any point in world history except for Jewish people. Very important point to keep in mind as we go into this discussion. But be it as it may, we jump into the 19th century. And this is coming after everything we discussed the past few weeks. This is coming after the Khmelnytsky massacres. This is coming after, now we have the Russian pogroms have come into full effect. This is coming after the Shabtai Tzvi debacle. This is coming after everything that we've talked about in the past few weeks. And that is the picture that is really painted for the beginning of the Zionist movement. So if we want to look to a date for the beginning of the Zionist movement, or the beginning of, we'll call it the real repopulation of Israel that we have experienced until today, it began with none other than the Vilna Gaon. Then the Vilna Gaon, Rav Elio Kramer of Vilna, who we discussed 2 weeks ago with the father of the Lithuanian Musar yeshiva movement. Again, not the father of the Musar movement, that was Yisrael Salanter, but really the great Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon was adamant that he himself wanted to settle in the land of Israel. Now, at that point, it had already been a thing, really since time immemorial, that even Jews who lived in the exile wanted to settle in the land of Israel, to die in the land of Israel, because there's special promises promised to someone who's buried in the land of Israel. But the Vilna Gaon is the first one who set the idea of not going to the land of Israel to die, but going to the land of Israel to live. And he tried several times to get to the land of Israel, never being able to make it. And eventually he took it as a divine decree that he was not meant to settle in the land of Israel. But many of his students did. And because those students, those disciples, ended up in the land of Israel and really were the beginning of what we refer to as the old yishuv, which was the original community in Jerusalem, because that's where they went. They went to Jerusalem. They set the tone for the community of Jerusalem until this day. Until this day in Jerusalem, the customs of the Vilna Gaon are followed almost to a T. If you want to really experience this, go to what is now known as what has really always been known as the Chorva Shul. I used to think the Chorva Shul was called the Chorva Shul because it was destroyed in the War of Independence, which it was. It was a beautiful shul that had existed for 3 centuries. It was destroyed in the War of Independence, and eventually in '67, when Jewish sovereignty over Jerusalem became a reality again, the Israeli government built an arch there, and that arch stood until whatever it was 2002, 2003, when the shul was actually rebuilt. The Chorva Shul was rebuilt, and I found out when I went to the Chorva Shul that they have the history of it on the wall, that it was actually called the Chorva Shul because it was destroyed during the old yishuv by some Arabs in the land who didn't like the fact that Jews were coming back to Jerusalem. So it was already destroyed and rebuilt in those days. So it was really for a long time had been called the Chorva Shul. Chorva is how I spell it, without the CH, without the chaf. But it comes from the word ches resh vez, which means to destroy, the destroyed shul, because it's destroyed not once but twice, and rebuilt not once but twice, just like the temple, if you will. But the Chorva Shul today is populated by the Zilberman group, which is a group that really abides by the Vilna Gaon's traditions to a T. So if you go in the Chorva Shul today, you'll see the Vilna Gaon's practices literally to a T. So the Vilna Gaon sets the tone in Israel. He is, shortly after him, there's some students of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov's brother-in-law and some of his disciples come also to Israel, and they settle mainly in Hebron. And even though the fight that we talked about between the Hasidim and the Misnadim was still alive and well in Europe at this time, those who came to settle in Israel put that behind them in Europe, and they lived in peace. And they are the ones who developed what's called the Old Yishuv. The third piece of the Old Yishuv was the Chasam Sofer, Moshe Sofer, who we discussed last week as a strong opponent to the Reform movement. His disciples also came to the land of Israel to be part of that Old Yishuv. So the Old Yishuv is built by first the students of the Vilna Gaon, then the Hasidim, and then the students of Moshe Sofer, the Chasam Sofer. And that's the Old Yishuv. By the year 1942, I believe, and there's different accounts, but somewhere between the 1940 and 1950, we already have a majority Jewish population in the city of Jerusalem. Not 1967, right? Not modern times. Already in 1842, I think it was, you had a majority Jewish population in Jerusalem, as it remained until 1948. And by the way, Jerusalem at this time still just means what we call the Old City today. The new city, we're going to see in a minute how it started to be built, but we're talking just about the Old City. So the Old City from the mid-19th century on until 1948, when the Jews are expelled by the Jordanians, has a majority Jewish population. And at this point, there's about 50,000 Jews in the land of Israel, and the European powers of the world. There's an interesting dichotomy that went on, that all of the European powers of the world, whether it was the British or the French or the Russian or the Habsburgs in Hungary, they all had a consulate in Israel, and they all looked at the Jews and the old yishuv as their wards to their stake of the land of Israel. Now, this was interesting because these are the same Russians that back in Russia are perpetrating the worst pogroms that the world has ever seen. Yet in Israel, they're supporting the old yishuv, they're supporting the community, and they're helping that community to exist and to thrive and to buy land from the Ottomans. Now, the question is why? And the answer is because at that point, the Ottomans were already well known as the sick men in Europe, and it was only a matter of time before they were toppled in one way, shape, or form. So all of the powers of the world wanted to be able to lay claim to the land of Israel when the Ottomans did in fact fall, which wouldn't happen until World War I, when they sided with the wrong side. They would side with the Germans, and the British already before the end of the war in 1917 would take control of the land of Israel and say the Balfour Declaration, which we'll get to. But that's why the Russians, while they're killing Jews in St. Petersburg, they're supporting them in Jerusalem. So there's a funny dichotomy that's going on at this point. So the development came. They were able to buy land up from the Turks, and that's what was happening with the what we call the first aliyah, the second aliyah, the third aliyah. All the land is being bought up from the Turks. The Turks are willing to sell it. The Turks don't want it, and that's the beginning of the resettlement of the land of Israel. Now, there's something else that happens at this time, and that is that, at least up until the first aliyah, which is the about 1860, I think is the year they give to the first aliyah. The Jews that came from Europe were not farmers, were not builders. They're good old Jewish boys, not used to building up land. And there was cheap labor available to those Jews who came in the first Aliyah. And what was that cheap labor? It was from the Arabs, the Arabs from the Ottoman Empire, who are not being treated very well in the Ottoman Empire and were living in poverty. And they essentially saw job opportunities in the land of Israel from the Jews who are going to resettle. And they came en masse to Israel for job opportunities. So when you want to look at the real beginning of the Arab-Israeli conflict, it starts here, because the population of the Arabs in Israel does not start before the Jews get there. As we mentioned, there was no one in the land before the Jews got there. But what happened is the Jews begin to resettle the land of Israel. The Arabs from other places in the Ottoman Empire come in a rate of 4-to-1, of 5-to-1, looking for job opportunities in the land of Israel. So when Yasser Arafat, Yamach Shemo, gets up in the UN and says, "My people have been here for 1,000 years," it's not true. It's not true. The Arab population of Israel today has been there about as long as we've been there in this incarnation of the land of Israel. And while there were the Bedouins, and some nomadic tribes that were there before, they ended up siding with Israel. I mean, the Bedouins are allies of Israel. They fight in the Israeli army, and the ones that are now in the refugee camps in the quote-unquote Palestinian territories, those are the ones that came in the mid-19th century when we came. So again, you won't find that in a lot of modern news, but that's the historical facts for what they are worth. Okay, so this is the situation. By the way, at this point, we're still pre-Zionism. The Zionist movement doesn't exist. This is still what we would call proto-Zionism at this point. But the question starts to be raised at this point, and that is that as you're seeing 50,000 Jews in Israel, mostly in Jerusalem, majority Jewish population in Jerusalem, the situation for Jews in Europe is terrible. It was clear that it was, to many it was clear there's going to be unsustainable for much longer. And that is, what's the religious perspective at this point? So there's a very important Gemara, a very important Talmudic statement. This is found in Ksuvos Kuf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph, that's page 111a. The Gemara over there says something fascinating. The Talmud says that when the Jews were exiled in the year 70 of the Common Era, that the Almighty and the Jewish people made 3 vows. There were 3 vows taken between the Jews and the Almighty, the Jews and God. And those 3 vows were as followed. Number 1, that the Jews should not ascend to the land of Israel en masse. In other words, the language of the Talmud is they should not come as a wall, meaning they shouldn't flood into the land of Israel during the exile. Number 2 is that the Jews should not rebel against the nations of the world. In other words, the Jews are going to be exiled amongst the nations of the world. We should at no point rebel against the nations of the world, because that subjugation to the nations is part of the exile that we're in. And number 3, it's that he made the third is actually the nations of the world, that he took a vow to the nations of the world that they should not subjugate the Jews excessively during their exile. In other words, we shouldn't be persecuted too much. Okay, so 3 parts to the vow. Number 1 is that we should not return to the land of Israel en masse during our exile. Number 2, we should not fight the subjugation of the nations of the world. And number 3, the nations of the world should not persecute us too excessively, too much. Okay, the question is, that's a homiletic statement of the Gemara. What does it mean practically? So Maimonides stood by this oath. He said this oath applies philosophically, it applies halachically, and the Jews should, the 2 that apply to the Jews, it should not be done until the Messianic era. The Rabbeinu Bechaya, another medieval commentator, agreed with Maimonides. Ramban Nachmanides disagrees. The Spanish Rabbi Nachmanides, who himself, when he was kicked out of Spain after the great debate that we talked about in the Converso discussion with Pablo Cristiani, he actually goes to the land of Israel. And he records that settling in the land of Israel is one of the 613 commandments of being a Jew. And he explains on a number of levels that these vows are homiletic ideas. And while they do apply to a certain extent, in other words, the Jews should not come back en masse, but we should go back into the land of Israel like he did. And we should for sure settle in the land of Israel, and we for sure shouldn't fight against the nations of the world, and the nations of the world shouldn't beat us up excessively. But a Jew is obligated to live in the land of Israel. That's what he had to say. Again, not like the other medieval commentators who did not agree with him, but he counted as one of the 613 commandments. The question is, how did this play up until the 18th century, the 19th century, as the discussion of Zionism was starting to arise? So there were 2 basic religious positions. One was the position of Rev Yehuda Alkali, who was a Sephardic rabbi who was a big Kabbalist and was of the opinion through his own Kabbalistic calculations that the time for the Jews to return to the land of Israel was for the Jewish century from the year 1840 to 1939. That would be basically before we're in the Jewish century 700 or 57, right? 700. That was 5600. The Jewish century of 5600 till 5699. He, according to his Kabbalistic calculation, said that was the century of redemption, and it was time for the Jews to start going back to the land of Israel for the beginning of the Messianic era. And he said the Talmud and was not a problem because, number 1, they were only trickling in. They weren't going with a wall. Number 2, they weren't fighting any wars because the Ottomans were welcoming the Jews to come in and buy up the land because they just wanted the money. And number 3, he said that the nations of the world did not keep their oath because they had persecuted the Jews too much. And so that part of the oath was null and void because they had violated it. And he said, there's no way we're going to survive in Europe. The persecution's too great. We have to go back to the land of Israel, and we have to get there by the year 1939. And he's writing this, by the way, in the year 1857. He's writing this. And he writes in almost prophetic words that if we don't get to the land of Israel by the end of the 5600s, by the end of the year 1939, then we'll still be in the Messianic era. But I quote, starting in 1940 would be one of the great hardships when with an outpouring of wrath will gather our disperse. The outcome, the return to the promised land, would be the same, but under much harsher circumstances. Again, coming from Kabbalistic ideas, coming from prophetic ideas. So he said that when our prophets talk about the destruction that will come before the Jews resettle the land of Israel, he said that begins in the year 1940. in almost prophetic words, right? It's almost scary to read the words looking back at the history of what happened after 1939. We all know, but almost to a T, 1939, World War II begins, and the whole discussion becomes a much different discussion after the Holocaust. So he put religious connotations on it. He said, this is the beginning of the Messianic era. We've got to go back to the land of Israel with Messianic pretensions. The polar opposite from him was the Yismach Moshe, Rav Moshe Teitelbaum, who was a Hasidic rabbi, the forerunner to the Satmar movement of today. One of his descendants was Rav Yoel Teitelbaum, who wrote extensively on his position, which was that the three oaths still apply 100%, and therefore Jews should not go back to the land of Israel, and we're not meant to go back till the Messiah comes to take us back. And any effort to go back is at least go back en masse, go back with any sovereignty, go back with any of this stuff. It is wrong. And that's been the position of his disciples, the Satmar Hasidim, until today. Again, coming from a theological position. That's not to mean you can't live in the land of Israel, as many Satmar Hasidim do. But again, you can't go back en masse, and you can't try and conquer the land. That's what Rav Moshe Teitelbaum said. Okay, so those are the two religious positions. Again, neither one is talking about sovereignty. There's no idea of a state. There's no Zionist movement. The Zionist movement still doesn't have a name. We're still the beginning of the second part of the 19th century. At this point, a very interesting group develops, which is led by two strange bedfellows. The movement is known as the Chovevei Tzion, the Lovers of Zion, and the two first leaders of the Chovevei Tzion is a Rabbi Samuel Shmuel Moliver, and Leon Pinsker. Now, Rabbi Shmuel Moliver was a Lithuanian rabbi, a descendant, a student of the Netziv, who was the head of the Volozhin Yeshiva. He himself studied in the Volozhin Yeshiva in Lithuania, had a big beard, a big frock, a big hat, big payas. He had it all. Big-time rabbi. But he was enamored with the idea that was actually expounded upon by the Netziv himself, that it was time, like we quoted from Rabbi Alkali, that it was time for the Jews to start going back to the land of Israel, because we weren't going to survive in Europe, because we weren't going to survive the pogroms of Europe, that the lights had been turned on in Europe. It was time to start going back to the land of Israel. And Shmuel Moliver loved this idea. He ran with this idea and became one of the founders of the Chovevei Tzion. The other founder was Rav Leon Pinsker, who was a big assimilationist. He himself was an assimilated Jew, and he believed, before he became a founder of Chovevei Tzion, he believed in what is called the assimilationist theory, that the only way that the Jews are going to avoid the anti-Semitism and the wrath of the non-Jews of Eastern Europe was to completely assimilate, to give up Judaism, to become Christian, to become German, Habsburg, whatever, to become, like your neighbors, and to totally give up Judaism. That was how to answer the Jewish question. And he eventually realized that that was an untenable position, and therefore did a 180 and became a Chovevei Tzion together with Rabbi Shmuel Moliver, and started pushing for Jews to return and buy up and settle in the land of Israel. And they lobbied a great Jewish philanthropist by the name of Edmund James de Rothschild, who bought into the idea lock, stock, and barrel, and became one of the first financiers of buying up land from the Ottomans in the land of Israel. Many people joined him, like Rav Moses Montefiore, and they began this process in the latter part of the 19th century of buying up the land of Israel from the Ottomans because it was for sale. Now, we're going to see that the same life story of Leon Pinsker, Herzl himself is going to have when we get to him. Because now enters stage right Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl was also a completely assimilated Jew from Vienna. He did not have a bar mitzvah himself. His son was not circumcised, as assimilated as you could possibly be. In 1894, as a reporter from Vienna, he covers the Dreyfus Affair in France, in which he saw the great land of the French Revolution, fraternity, brotherhood, all the ideas of Western culture that he believed in so dearly. He saw those same people screaming, not death to the traitor, not death to the anarchist or whatever they wanted to call Alfred Dreyfus at the time, but they were screaming death to the Jews. And every anti-Semitic slur that could possibly be screamed is what he heard on the streets of France. And he looked at this in disgust, and he said, this is really the attitude of the people of Europe, we got to do something about this. And at that point, in 1894, he becomes a warrior of anti-Semitism, against anti-Semitism. And again, like Leon Pinsker, at first, he believes that the only way you're going to stop anti-Semitism is to give up this Jewish thing. Now, again, this is all still before Hitler. In Hitler, giving up Judaism didn't help, right? It became racial with Hitler. But this is also before that. It wasn't yet racial. It was still religious per se. And he himself wrote that Jews should march to the baptismal fount. And that's how we're going to deal with the anti-Semitic problems of Europe. That lasted about 1 year. And by a year into his crusade to stop anti-Semitism, he realized that it wasn't going to work. He realized that it was untenable, and he realized that the hatred was even too deep, maybe even at some level seeing what was to lay in the future with Hitler, Yamach Shemo, and the transition of anti-Semitism to not be religious, but to be racial. And in 1895, he writes the famous book, his famous magnum opus, Der Judenstaat, which means the Jewish state, in which he put forth his idea that the only way for the Jews to avoid the anti-Semitism and pogroms and hatred of the non-Jews of Europe was for the Jews to be a nation like every other nation, with the government, like every other government. And again, it was not a theological thing. He did not necessarily believe in any of the theological ideas that were floating around in the world. But it is interesting to point out that his grandfather was a congregant of Rabbi Alkalai's synagogue, who was the first one to expound the religious idea of Zionism. But be it as it may, it was completely political for Herzl. He did not believe in the religious motivations, but he believed that this is how you're going to stop anti-Semitism. The Jews have to have their own state and be a nation like all other nations. And if we were a nation like all other nations, then they'd leave us alone. Now, this is not to be confused with which later became a pretense for the land of Israel, that we have to have our own army, we have to actively fight anti-Semitism, and which is because, again, no one could imagine Hitler at this point. All he could imagine was getting the Jews out of Europe, having their own land, and if we were a nation like all other nations, then they would finally leave us alone. And that was Herzl's goal. For Herzl, we're going to see it didn't necessarily have to be the land of Israel. But Herzl is really, his life's work becomes for the next 9 years until he dies literally of exhaustion and penniless, spending every penny he ever had on the Zionist movement, was to lobby governments around the world to support the Zionist movement, to support the idea of the Jews' return to the land of Israel, and to support the idea of a Jewish state. In 1897, 2 years after he wrote Der Judenstaat, he convenes what's known as the First Zionist Congress. And he says at that point in his opening words, were I to sum up the Basel Congress in a word, which I shall guard against pronouncing publicly. I'm sorry, he wrote this in his diary. He wrote, it would be at this. At the Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If I said this out loud today, I would be greeted by universal laughter. In 5 years, perhaps, and certainly in 50 years, everyone will perceive it. And he wrote those words in 1897, and we all know 51 years later, there was a modern day state of Israel. But Herzl, him was about having a state. But he was a great politician. So he wanted to bring together all the different factions of proto-Zionism. So he wanted to embrace the religious. He embraced Rav Kook. He embraced the ideas of Rav Alkalai. He embraced Rav Shmuel Moelhofer. He embraced all these ideas and brought all together. So within the First Zionist Congress, there are both the religious Zionists and the secular Zionists coming together. Of course, the secular Zionists are saying, we want a Jewish state. The religious Zionists are saying it's got to be in Israel. And that became a great debate and discussion, which comes to a head in 1903, when through Herzl's lobbying, the British Empire offered the African colony of Uganda to Herzl as a Jewish state. And Herzl believed that they should take it. Now, it's a debate as to if he really at this point did not believe that the land of Israel had any significance whatsoever and just wanted a Jewish state wherever in the world it could be, whether it's Argentina or whether it's off of, up by Niagara Falls in the place called Ararat, as was once discussed for a Jewish homeland. It's unclear if he really did not believe in the Jewish value of Israel at that point, or if he believed that this was a first step, that we'll start off in Uganda, we'll build a country in Uganda, Russia, and then eventually we'll get sovereignty and the land of Israel and be able to move our country over there. Again, you'll hear different things from different historians, and we don't have to exacerbate the point here. But needless to say, he thought that the Uganda plan was very important, and he pushed it forward. And in the 1903, in the Sixth Zionist Congress, it passed by a small margin. At that point, the Russian delegation got up and walked out, because the Russians got up and said, you just don't get it. They're literally slaughtering us in Russia, and we need to take our homeland. We need to take the land of Israel. That's what we need to take for this to work. It can't be any other land. It has to be the land of Israel. Herzl passes away in an untimely age in his 40s in 1904. The Uganda plan is voted out in the next Zionist Congress because you didn't have Herzl there to push it through. And within a short period of time, the British take away the offer. So the Uganda scheme dies in committee very, very quickly. And from that point, the unilateral focus on a Jewish state in the land of Israel becomes the focus of every subsequent Zionist Congress, which happens virtually every year until the outbreak of World War I, then several years between World War I and World War II. And it's now the WZO, which we just had a conference last year, which I believe, Mikhail, you're a delegate with them or something like that, right?
No, it's not last year. The elections were the elections to this very Congress that you're talking about. It still goes on every 5 years. Like over in March, and
were you elected? You were elected, right?
Well, I'm on the slate.
On the slate, there you go.
As
okay.
expected, I'm like pretty far down, but
yeah,
alternate.
You're on the slate.
Well, but now
slate.
with all the people not traveling, and who knows what's going to happen months from now, and there are delays. I'm also in World Likud thing too. Apparently, I'm going to have to do that too. So with all the people still scared to travel, I may actually have to go. We'll see.
Yeah. Okay. Should be fun. Anyhow, so that's the incarnation of the Zionist Congress, now the WZO. But this is the beginning of Zionism, and we're going to see that Zionism comes, goes on after Herzl for 13 more years. And in 1917, the British in the wake of World War I and the collapse, or the almost collapse of the Ottoman Empire, take control of the land of Israel 2 years before the end of the war. The Balfour Declaration is proclaimed, saying that His Majesty's government looks favorably upon a Jewish settlement in the land of Israel. Did not mention a state. The Balfour Declaration did not mention a state at all. And the goal, even of the most Zionistic British government official, which Lord Balfour was that there should be a Jewish colony in the land of Israel under the British Empire, that it never did they intend for anything to be outside the British Empire. And even though that was adopted as part of the British mandate after World War I, that was their goal, to build a British colony, for Israel to be part of the British Empire, and for there to be a Jewish presence there. We're going to see that they miscalculated the, really one person, Haj Amin al-Husseini, Yamach Shemo, the Mufti of Jerusalem, who was able to rally together the Arab population in the land of Israel, really against the idea of a Jewish presence. And that led to the British eventually rescinding the Balfour Declaration with the white paper. And the white paper, they say the promise of the Balfour Declaration is already realized because of the presence that we have here. They tremendously limited Jewish immigration to Israel from that point on. And really the debate becomes, with the outbreak of World War II, and Hitler, Yamach Shemo, and now realizing that anti-Semitism becomes a racial issue, that the debate of the Jews that were living in Israel at that time was, do we fight with the British or do we fight against the British? So because they looked at the British as really, they were subjugating them to a certain extent. But at the same time, the British are fighting Hitler, who's killing Jews in Europe. So it was a big debate on which side to fight for or against. The Ben Gurion camp, which was the Haganah, believed in, they fought with the British. Begin ended up going with that camp as well. Jabotinsky, Begin went with that camp. That's what later became Likud, or Lehi, as it was called before the state. And the Stern Gang did not go with. The Stern Gang actually fought against the British even during the war, and they believed in. They even tried to reach out to the Germans, like help us put down the Germans, and we'll take the land of Israel afterwards. That was the approach of the Stern Gang. But be it as it may, that's how Zionist activity played forth in World War II. After World War II, the whole story changes. right? I want to get there in a minute because we'll wrap up with that. But the question is up until this point, before World War before World War II, as you have the Zionist movement active, you have this sort of internal struggle, the Zionist movement between the religious, people put religious emphasis on it, people put non-religious emphasis on it. And what's the response of the Jewish world in general? How do we break up the Jewish world at this point? So we can really break up the Jewish world we'll break it up into four groups. The first group is the Reform movement, as we talked about last week. So the Reform movement is in the late 19th century, still in Germany. In the late 19th century, they're also rebuilding in America, and into the 20th century. And until really the 1960s, as we mentioned last week, the Reform movement is vehemently anti-Zionist. They take any mention of Israel and Jerusalem out of the prayer book, and they will not do it's almost high holiday time. It's time for the annual Israel bond solicitation. They would not do that in their synagogues until the 1960s. 1960s with the latter platforms, they do change and they write Israel back into their platform, so to speak. But at least in the early days of the Zionist movement, the Reform movement in Germany and in America was vehemently anti-Zionist and was a thorn in the side of Herzl and his movement. The other strong opponent from within the Jewish world was the left in general. By the left, we can mean the Bund, we can mean the communist, two different Jewish groups that threw off Judaism altogether. And in throwing off Judaism, they, of course, threw out the idea of a Jewish national identity, because the Bund said, we're socialist, and the communist leaders said we're communists, and the problem is not anti-Semitism, the problem is not Judaism, the problem is capitalism. If we can get capitalism in the world, then we'd all be equal, we'd all be the same, and there's no need for Judaism, no place for Judaism. That's what the left said at that time, and therefore did not in any way, shape, or form support Zionism. We're going to see, interesting, that when the state is declared by Herzl, the state is declared by Ben Gurion in 1948, May 4th, 1948, that Truman was himself debating, and there was a whole thing back and forth, recognizing, not recognizing. But once he found out that Stalin was going to recognize the country, he jumped on the phone to be the first country to recognize the state of Israel, because he didn't want Stalin to beat him. Because at the beginning of the state, it was unclear that maybe the socialist ideas would be adopted to the state. And while to a certain extent they were, it was clear that the state of Israel was not going to be part of the Second World, was not going to be part of the Warsaw Pact. It was going to be part of NATO and the First World and be part of the West. But that was unclear at the founding of the state. Okay, so you have the Reform movement, anti-Zionist. You have the left in general, very anti-Zionist. And you have the majority of European Jewry who are still religious Jews who for the most part are not pro-Zionist. That's because they didn't buy into this religious idea that was being said by Rav Yehuda Alkali and being expounded upon now by Rav Kook, who was the big one expounding this idea of Ram Yitzchak Cohen Cook, and much of Europe's religious community did not believe in the Zionist movement. First of all, like I said, they did believe in the religious philosophy. And second of all, because of the heavy secular influence, they were concerned that if the religious Jews would go to the land of Israel and side with the secularists, that they would throw off Judaism for secularism, which we saw was in fact true, because that's what many of them did when they either came to America or went to Israel. That we talked about in last week's session, that the faith of much of the religious community of Europe at that time was a mile wide and an inch deep. Why is it that most of the Jews in Europe kept Shabbos? Because most of the Jews in Europe kept Shabbos, and it was not a very deep conviction or connection to Judaism. So that fear proved to be true, that many of these religious Jews in Europe with getting involved in Zionism would throw off Torah observance in place of Zionism, and Zionism would become the new religion, if you will. But there was a hybrid that did develop. Rav Yehuda Alkali's movement and Rav Kook's movement, and what became Rav Meir Bar-Ilan's movement became what is known today as Mizrahi. And Mizrahi became the synthesis of religious ideals together with Zionism. And even within the early days of Mizrahi, there was a dissenting opinion. There was the view of Rav Kook, who echoed the previous view of Rav Yehuda Alkali, that this is the Messianic movement. This is Reishi Smichas Guloseno. This is the beginning of our redemption. This is religious in nature, and that's what he said is the position of Mizrahi. But there were plenty of others in Mizrahi who said, no, this is just practical. We got to get out of Europe. Mashiach will come when Mashiach comes, but we got to get out of Europe. And what better place to get out of Europe and go to than the land of Israel? So we'll make a reconciliation with the secularists and we'll make it work. But be it as it may, where we need to get to the land of Israel, and that's what we're going to do. Now, Rav Kook's philosophy clearly won out, and that's the philosophy of Mizrahi today, that the modern-day state of Israel has religious connotations. We talked about this in the class that we did on Yom HaAtzmaut and the different positions there that lie within, but that's the position of the Mizrahi movement until this very day. Practically, the Holocaust comes along 1939, 1945, or more specifically 1941 to 1945, Nazi Germany, the war, and that changes everything. Because as we said before, at this point now, anti-Semitism, they realize is racial, it's not theological, and there becomes a whole new philosophy. The Jews need a safe haven, and the Jews need a place to go, and the Jews need an army to defend them, and you know that's what is needed from the Jewish. That's what's needed from the land of Israel. So there's a whole new twist on the Zionist movement that never existed before. Today, that's so very much part of the discussion in Israel. In fact, I often tell the story that when I was at the FIDF dinner last year, the rabbi, I forget his name, but the international head of Mizrahi, when he spoke about Israel and the importance of the IDF and the importance of the state of Israel in terms of never again, which I think is terrible, by the way. I think it's terrible. I do, because and I speak openly to my friends who are soldiers in the army, who fought in the army, who are reserves in the army, who are alumni of the army, about this point, about how if the state of Israel is going to carry on and their definition for existing is going to always be never again, then what happens when there's not an anti-Semite rearing his ugly face? Like, what's the purpose of the land of Israel then? What's the purpose of the state of Israel then? I think that we need to embrace today where we stand in the world. And that is that we are living in the most miraculous times ever. I've said it a million times, I've said it once, that we're the first Jews since the destruction of the first temple, not the second temple, because during the second temple, there was not a majority of the Jews in the world living in Israel. Since the destruction of the first temple, we can look and see the majority of the world Jewish population living in Israel. We see sovereignty over Jerusalem. We see more Torah study going on now in the city of Jerusalem and the land of Israel than there was since the destruction of the second temple and the academies of Yavna, the great academies that existed in that time. We're living literally in miraculous times. Now, for all of us, it's going to mean something different religiously, wherever we are in the religious spectrum. Whether it's ready for religious expression, whether it's not yet quite ready for religious expression, whether we should be saying Hallel on Yom HaAtzmaut, should not be saying Hallel. Again, see my class on Yom HaAtzmaut for more discussion on that. But be it as it may, we see that to a certain extent, Herzl was overturned because of the Holocaust. The socialist idea is completely dead today. The kibbutzim for the most part have capitalized. They've gone private, and we're still trying to figure out where it all plays in. It's still a struggle. The state of Israel is still very young. It's 75, and a lot of these struggles and discussions still go on. The conflict between the secular and the religious that went on from the first Zionist Congress is still very much alive today in the land of Israel, and still plays itself out in the Knesset, and still played itself out very much in the past election and the sequel and part 3 and part 4, right? It was very much part of the discussion. So a lot of this struggle, this fight, if you will, of Zionism, yes Zionism, no Zionism, religious, secular, that has gone on since the beginning of the Zionist movement, it's still very much alive and well today. And just like I always say that I don't see how the Arab-Israeli conflict is going to be completely resolved with anything short of the Messianic era, a lot of the internal Jewish conflict over the state of Israel is not going to be resolved with anything short of the Mashiach to come and tell us how it should be and set us straight. So it's very much a struggle that's alive and well today. And with that, I will open it up to the floor to any questions, comments, jokes, concerns, anything that we have. Tim, just glance over to the chat box, see if any questions came in. Okay. Any questions? Feel free to unmute yourself.
How did they come up with the name for the Mizrahi movement when it sounds like it was mostly Ashkenazim who started it?
That's a very good question. So tied up into, as every wise question is usually the case, there's more to the question meets the eye. The name that we call, and I think we talked about this in our class on Sephardic Jewry, but the name that we refer to Sephardic Jews as is Sephardic Jews, not the right pronunciation, is not the right name, because what we now call Sephardic Jews not all come from Spain, and only Jews from Spain should be called Sephardic Jews, but Jews that come from the East. Meaning what's really the West, right? That's our East, right? Because really the West are where the Jews were at that time, but they're called Mizrahim. They're called Eastern Jews. That's what we refer to the Jews from North Africa, the Jews from Iraq, which is the East, the Jews from Azerbaijan, the Azerbaijanis from Russia, from the Balkan states. Those are all called Eastern Jews or Mizrahim. But bottom line is, we refer to a lot in our theology, in our theology and our prophets, etc. We talk about Israel as being in the East. So we talk about, even though for a long time Jews in Western Europe prayed south, Jews in Eastern Europe prayed west, there's a concept of Israel very much being in the East. So I think that's why the Mizrahi movement took that name Mizrahi as the name to the movement. What's interesting, by the way, in the Talmud, they do not refer to Israel as the East. In the Talmud, they refer to Israel as the West. Right? But Ma'arava, you'll hear the term Ma'arava. There's a camp in Indiana, a Jewish camp called Ma'arava, which means the West, because it's west of the East Coast, right? It's a Midwest camp. But in the Talmud, Israel is referred to as Ma'arava. Now, why is that? Because it's the Babylonian Talmud. Where's the Babylonian Talmud? Babylonian Talmud was written in Babylon, in Iraq, which is to the east of Jerusalem, meaning Israel. I mean, to the east of Israel, which means Israel's the West. So Israel's always the West in the Talmud. But yeah, so I think that's where it came from, where the name Mizrahi came from. Are some of the kibbutzim part of the left? I mean, the kibbutzim were socialist communes. They were very much part. I mean, that's what they are. They're we call the left, labor, socialistic ideas. That's what the kibbutzim were. Today, most of the kibbutzim are privatized. They're not communes anymore. They have relics of the past still as part of their ideals and everything, but a lot of the socialist dream has died out in Israel. It doesn't really exist much anymore in the state of Israel. Okay, any other questions, comments, concerns, good jokes, bad jokes, good stories? Okay, so feel free to shoot me up with any questions you have throughout the week. I'm always happy to discuss any of the topics we talk about. Once again, next week, we will have our first in our holiday series of Subject to Change, Stop Resisting, and Start Growing. That'll be next week's session. It'll, again, if you signed up for the Zoom link, for the Zoom class, that means this will remain the link, and you're already approved. Feel free to share, not the link to the class, please don't share that with anybody, but feel free to share the sign up link with whoever you want. And once you sign up, you'll be always able to get in just by clicking on the link, and we'll have the waiting room enforced just in case. But you don't need to sign up again once you signed up. Okay. Mikhail, I see you unmuted. You're trying to go back to our discussion from before the class? Or he signed out? I know there is.
No, not really.
Yeah.
I did have a question, but I don't even know if I care for the answer. It was more curiosity. If any of those Satmars really still anti-Israeli? And as far as I can tell, there's only 24 Nutri Carter people that are proven to be on Iranian payroll.
Yeah. I mean, that's
an anti-Zionist. I can't find any other Jews of any sort of things that are anti-Zionist.
Good question. First of all, important distinction. It's a very important distinction to make whenever possible. Neturei Karta and Satmar are not the same thing. They're not the same thing at all, and should not be confused for one another. One of the stories I always like to tell is one of the Satmar, the first Satmar Rebbe after the war to visit Israel. They asked him upon arriving in Israel if he was going to meet with Yasser Arafat, to which he responded, "Yasser Arafat? Why would I meet with him? He kills Jews." Again, this was way before Oslo. This is even before he tried to put on a political show. Right? This is someone, he's in Jordan, and he's in Lebanon, and then Tunisia. Right? This is when he's really an out terrorist to everybody. And Satmar is not Neturei Karta. Neturei Karta are the ones who believe when we talked about the three vows, they believe in it so much so that they believe in allying themselves with the Palestinians and allying themselves with the Iranians. And they're the ones you see, wearing the Palestinian scarves and going to hug Ahmadinejad, Yamach Shemo at the anti-Holocaust conference, at the Holocaust deniers conference. That's the Neturei Karta. The Neturei Karta is a tiny group that amounts to maybe 50 families in Meir Sharim and 50 families in Muncie who must have the best PR department in the history of the world, because one Neturei Karta whispers something to another one in Shul, on the front page of the New York Times. They think it's some mass movement. Most of them, I hate to say this, but are people who did not grow up with a strong religious background. Many of them are Baalei Tshuva and converts to Judaism who don't have a clear path, and they somehow gravitate towards this. That's who these groups tend to feed upon, is people who are looking for their anchor in Judaism. And it's a very, very small fringe group. Satmar is still a very big group. Satmar, you go to Williamsburg, New York today, it's a huge group, a huge presence there. Monroe, New York is a Satmar town. It's also known as Kiryas Yoel, and this is their position. Their position is that the state of Israel is not a positive step towards Mashiach. It's not a positive step towards the Messianic era. And when Mashiach comes, then we'll go to the land of Israel. And that is their position. If you talk to now again, you only find them in Williamsburg, New York, and in Monroe, New York. That's really where their community is. They're not coming to Cleveland too often, right? So you have to interact with them there. So that's the Satmar Hasidim, and the other group is known as the Neturei Karta, which means garters of the faith. A very small group. It does barely exist today, just with great PR. That's what they're famous for. But that's where you find the religious anti-Zionism. Really, it's Satmar, but Satmar is not in the Neturei Karta. Satmar does not believe in aligning themselves with Palestinians or the Iranians or any of the or Holocaust deniers. That's not them. They agree that that's terrible. They just believe in what we said was the approach of the Talmud, as been expounded upon by the Yismach Moshe, who was their intellectual forefather of their Hasidic group, and that until the Messiah comes, it's not time to go back to the land of Israel. And for sure, again, you can visit there, you can live there, but for sure we shouldn't have sovereignty until the Messiah comes. But Satmar is also not a huge group. Satmar is maybe if you take even just the Orthodox world, it's maybe 5% of the Orthodox world. So if the Orthodox world is about 30% of the Jewish world, or 40% of the Jewish world altogether, 35%, whatever the number is. What did we say last? Well, we're 2 million out of the affiliated world. That's what we said in last week's class. So that's 2 million out of the 12 million, but 2 million out of the 6 million that actually affiliate. Satmar is maybe 5% of that. So you extrapolate to the whole Jewish world, they're a very, very small number. Again, because of their somewhat extreme positions, they become very well known. Netflix loves them. If you saw Unorthodox, that's the Satmar Hasidim. Not a very fair portrayal, a pretty unorthodox portrayal of them, if I do say so, because it's not accurate. It was not accurate, but that's the Satmar Hasidim. And that is their position until today. But it's only, like I said, that maybe 5% of the Orthodox community are Satmar Hasidim, and the other 95% are somewhere on the perspective or on the spectrum of saying we're definitely living during somewhere in the question is, are we still in the birth pains of the Messianic era, or have we already entered the first fruits of the Messianic era? Do we say Hallel and Yom Ha'atzmaut? Do we not say Hallel and Yom Ha'atzmaut? That's the debate and discussion over the other 95% of the Orthodox Jewish world. So I hope that gave a good answer to your question, Mikhail.
Yes, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you. Any other questions, comments, concerns before we sign off here today? Okay, we'll look forward to next week. Next week's exciting pre-Rosh Hashanah event. We'll have the next 2 weeks. We'll be talking about different great ideas about the holidays. Share it with your friends, and we hope to see you all there. Everyone have a great week and be well.
Take care.